She had set his place at the table every single morning for 312 days. That morning she didn't. She folded the linen cloth in her hands, pressed it flat against the wooden surface, and walked away. No tears. No slamming door. Just the sound of her boots crossing the floor, slow and certain, as a woman who had finally made peace with something she could not change. If you've ever loved someone who simply refused to see you stay with us, subscribe and tell us in the comments, what city are you watching from tonight? The summer of 1814 arrived in Virginia without mercy. The heat settled over the Whitmore estate like a heavy wool blanket. No one could shake off it, pressed into the wooden beams of the main house, soaked into the red clay soil of the tobacco fields, and hung over the river bottom in thick, wet silence. By the time July turned the corn stalks gold at the edges, the workers had already taken to rising before dawn, just to move through the cool hours, before the sun made the air feel solid. Evelyn Carter noticed all of it. She noticed the way the kitchen fire needed to be started earlier in summer to avoid trapping heat into the afternoon. She noticed that the dairy cows gave less milk when kept in the southern paddock, where there was no shade after noon. She noticed that old Thomas, who managed the grain stores, had begun favoring his left leg, which meant she needed to reassign the heavier carrying work before he injured himself further and left them short-handed at harvest. She noticed everything about the Whitmore estate. She noticed nothing about herself anymore. That had stopped sometime in the winter. She couldn't name the exact day. It had happened the way a candle dies, not all at once, but gradually, the flame pulling inward, growing smaller and smaller, until one morning you reach for the light and find only cold wax. Evelyn Carter had arrived at the Whitmore estate the previous October as a bride. She had not arrived as a choice. Her father, William Carter, had been a merchant of moderate success in Richmond, dealing in dry goods fabric and the kind of careful social positioning that kept a family respectable without ever making them truly wealthy. When his business partner absconded with the capital reserves in the spring of 1813, taking with him 2 seasons of profits and leaving behind only debts with the bank and creditors in 3 counties, William Carter found himself in the kind of position that good men in bad circumstances often find, looking at his eldest daughter and calculating what she might be worth to someone who needed what he still had to offer. What he still had to offer was a connection to the Whitmore family through a distant cousin and a daughter who was educated, quiet, and presentable. What Nathaniel Whitmore needed at 32 years old was a wife who would manage his household produce and air and not make inconvenient demands on his emotional attention. The arrangement suited both fathers. No one asked Evelyn. She had met Nathaniel Whitmore exactly 3 times before their wedding. The first time he shook her hand and asked about her education. The second time he discussed the terms with her father, while she sat in the parlor and counted the stripes on the wallpaper. The third time he placed a ring on her finger in front of a minister and 17 guests, and when the ceremony was concluded, he offered her his arm, with the practiced politeness of a man who had been taught proper conduct from childhood. He did not smile. He did not look at her with anything she could name. She told herself it would come. That was what women told themselves in 1814. That warmth took time. That a man's affection had to be earned through patience and usefulness. That if she was good enough, capable enough, quiet enough, efficient enough, eventually he would turn toward her the way a plant turns toward sunlight, slow but inevitable. She had been wrong. The morning everything shifted began like every other morning that summer. Evelyn was in the kitchen before 6 speaking with Dolly the housekeeper about the week's provisions. They were low on salt pork. The flour barrel had been infested with weevils and needed replacing. And one of the field workers' wives had delivered a baby 2 nights ago and would need a meal sent over. "I'll have Thomas take something over this afternoon," Evelyn said, making a note in the household ledger she carried everywhere. "Cornbread, some of the salted butter, and whatever's left of the preserves from last week." "Yes, ma'am." Dolly hesitated. "You know Mr. Whitmore don't usually approve sending provisions off the property outside harvest time." "Mr. Whitmore won't notice," Evelyn said without bitterness. "Just fact. And even if he does, I'll explain it. "A woman just had a child, Dolly. We send food." Dolly nodded, said nothing more, and Evelyn moved on. She was crossing through the main hall when she heard voices in Nathaniel's study, the low murmur of a conversation that had been going on for some time. She recognized the second voice before she reached the door. It belonged to Margaret Hale, the widow of a neighboring landowner who had been calling at the Whitmore estate with increasing frequency over the past 2 months. Evelyn did not stop. She was not the kind of woman who pressed her ear to closed doors. But she had spent 10 months learning the acoustics of this house, and the study door was cracked not by accident, she suspected, but by the same carelessness with which Nathaniel treated all things he did not consider important enough to manage carefully. She heard Margaret Hale laugh low, easy, the laugh of a woman completely comfortable in a space. She heard Nathaniel respond with something she couldn't make out, but the tone was different, lighter, almost warm. Evelyn stood in the hallway for one moment. Then she walked to the dining room, sat down alone at the table where breakfast had been laid, and poured herself coffee with steady hands. Nathaniel Whitmore came into the dining room at 7:30. Margaret Hale was at his side, still laughing at something. He pulled out a chair for her, an automatic gesture, the kind a man did without thinking, and then sat himself at the head of the table. He glanced at Evelyn. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she replied. That was the entirety of it. That was the whole of their marriage compressed into 4 words exchanged across a breakfast table, and then he turned back to Margaret Hale, and the conversation resumed, as though Evelyn were not present at all. She ate her breakfast. She refilled her coffee. She listened to the two of them discuss the upcoming harvest fair in Fredericksburg, whether the roads would be passable in August, who was expected to attend what the Hargrove family had done with their north field. At no point did Nathaniel turn to ask her opinion. At no point did Margaret Hale acknowledge her presence beyond a single glance when she first sat down. Evelyn finished her meal, set down her fork, quietly picked up her household ledger, and went back to work. Dumb. She had known about Margaret Hale since January. Not from Nathaniel, he never told her anything directly. She had pieced it together the way she pieced together everything in this house, from silences, from the way conversations stopped when she entered a room, from the careful language of people who were working to keep something from her, while simultaneously not caring quite enough to be thorough about it. Margaret Hale had been the woman Nathaniel Whitmore intended to marry. Before her husband's death, she had been unavailable. When Mr. Hale died in the spring of 1813, Nathaniel had apparently renewed his interest, only to find that the social and financial pressures his own family was navigating made a quick match with the Carter girl the more practical choice. Margaret was recently widowed and still managing her estate. The timing wasn't right. The arrangement with the Carters moved faster. Evelyn had been in the most precise language possible, a scheduling conflict that became a wife. She had never confronted Nathaniel with this knowledge. She had asked herself many times why she didn't, and the answer she kept returning to was the most honest one, because she already knew what he would say. He would say it was business. He would say she was being dramatic. He would say he treated her with respect and propriety, which was true, and that his private feelings were his own affair, which was also true, and that she had everything she needed, which was the cruelest truth of all. Because she had everything, except the one thing she had somehow still been hoping for, even after she'd told herself she'd stopped hoping. She had a name. She had a house. She had a role. She just didn't have a husband who saw her. It was the last week of July when Jonathan Pierce arrived. He came recommended by the county land office to survey the eastern acreage of the Whitmore property, which had been in a long-standing boundary dispute with the neighboring Aldrich family. Nathaniel had been trying to resolve the matter for 2 years. Pierce was said to be thorough and fair, and he came with good references from 3 counties north. Evelyn met him first. Nathaniel was out inspecting the tobacco harvest when the surveyor arrived, and Dolly came to find Evelyn in the kitchen garden where she was assessing the fall planting schedule. "There's a man at the front, ma'am. Says he's here about the east fields." Evelyn wiped her hands on her apron, smoothed her hair, and walked to the front of the house. Jonathan Pierce was standing on the porch, hat in hand, studying the property lines on a sketch he'd pulled from his leather satchel. He was perhaps 30 years old, lean and tanned from outdoor work with an easy manner about him, the kind of man who moved through the world without bracing against it. He looked up when she appeared. "Mrs. Whitmore?" He gave a small respectful nod. "Jonathan Pierce, County Land Office. I'm here to survey the eastern boundary. I was told to report to Mr. Whitmore." "My husband is in the fields," Evelyn said. "I can show you the property records in the meantime if that would be useful." He looked at her, actually looked at her the way people look when they're genuinely curious about what someone has to say. "That'd be very useful, ma'am. Thank you." She brought him to the small office off the main hall, the one she'd claimed as her own working space over the past months, where she kept the estate ledgers, the land records, the correspondence with suppliers and creditors, and the careful notes she'd been making about the soil quality in the southern fields. She pulled the land records, spread them on the table, and began explaining what she knew about the eastern boundary dispute, which was considerable. She had read every document. She had corresponded with the county land office herself when Nathaniel's initial attempts to resolve the matter had stalled. Jonathan Pierce listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't look past her shoulder for Nathaniel. He didn't make the slight adjustment in expression that men sometimes made when a woman started talking about something they considered outside her domain, that small, almost imperceptible shift toward patience or condescension. He just listened. "You've done a good deal of work on this already," he said when she finished. "Someone had to," she replied. Then, hearing the edge in her own voice, she softened it. "The dispute was affecting our relationship with the Aldrich family. I didn't want it to become a matter for lawyers." That was smart? He wasn't being flattering. He was stating an assessment the way someone does when they've just seen a practical solution to a real problem. Most people wait too long on these things. "Yes," Evelyn said. "They do." Odd. Nathaniel returned from the fields at midday, still smelling of tobacco and sweat, and found Pierce and Evelyn in the main hall discussing the Eastern Acreage Survey approach. He greeted Pierce with a handshake, clapped him on the shoulder, in the way men greeted other men they expected to respect, and then turned to Evelyn with his usual courtesy. "Has he been well taken care of?" "I showed him the land records," Evelyn said. "We've already identified the primary points of dispute." Nathaniel looked at Pierce. Pierce nodded. "Your wife has a thorough understanding of the property, sir. Saved me several hours of preliminary work." Something crossed Nathaniel's face, not displeasure exactly, more a kind of recalibration. A man realizing that something had happened in his house without him. "Good," he said. "Good." He said it the way men say something when they don't quite know what else to say. Over the following week, Jonathan Pierce worked the eastern fields, and each evening he brought his notes back to the main house to cross-reference with the estate records. Each evening, Evelyn was the one who sat with him at the table, not because Nathaniel refused. He was present sometimes at the beginning of these sessions, asking practical questions about acreage and boundary markers. But after the first few evenings he drifted. There were letters to write. There were accounts to review. There was, Evelyn noticed, an increasing amount of correspondence going to the Hale estate. So she sat with Jonathan Pierce, and they worked through the records together, and somewhere in those evenings, something shifted, not between them exactly, but within her. "Can I ask you something?" Pierce said one evening when the records were spread between them and the candles were burning low. "You may," Evelyn said. "The crop rotation plan in the South Field that's not standard for this region. Where did you get it?" "I read about the methods they're using in the river valleys further north," she said. "Tobacco depletes the soil badly. The plan extends the productive life of the field by 3 years, maybe 4, before it needs to go fallow." He studied the notes. "This is going to matter significantly when the estate passes to an heir. You've basically bought the family a generation of agricultural stability." He paused. "Does Mr. Whitmore know you developed this?" Evelyn set down her pen. "Mr. Whitmore," she said carefully, "knows that the Southfield plan was revised this spring." Pierce was quiet for a moment. He was the kind of man who understood what was said, and also what wasn't. "You're the one keeping this estate running," he said, not as a compliment, as a plain statement of something he had observed and was simply naming. Evelyn looked at the candle flame. "Someone has to," she said. She was carrying grain ledgers to the storage room 3 days later when she heard Nathaniel and Margaret Hale on the east porch. The window to the study was open. That carelessness again, that failure to close doors fully when he didn't think it mattered. "She's not what I expected," Margaret was saying. Evelyn slowed without meaning to. "She's capable enough," Nathaniel replied. His voice was even measured, the voice he used for everything, for business decisions, for weather, for her. "She seems lonely," Margaret said. Silence. "She has a full household to manage," Nathaniel said. "She's not idle." "That isn't what I meant, Nathaniel." Another silence, longer this time. "She knew what this arrangement was," he said. "Did she?" Margaret's voice was quiet, not accusing, just asking. Evelyn did not wait to hear the answer. She walked to the storage room, set the ledgers on the shelf with careful hands, and stood in the cool dark for a long moment, with her eyes closed. She knew what this arrangement was. She thought about the girl she had been 10 months ago, sitting in her father's parlor, counting the stripes on the wallpaper while two men discussed her future. Had that girl known? Had she understood clearly that she was walking into a house where she would be a function rather than a person, where she would be adequate and present and entirely unseen? She had suspected. She had hoped she was wrong. She pressed her palm flat against the wooden shelf and breathed. And something in her chest, some last stubborn hope that she had been carrying through 10 months of silent breakfasts and empty evenings and good mornings that meant nothing, went very quiet. Not gone, not yet, but quiet in the way of something preparing to die. The first Sunday in August, the Whitmore estate hosted a small gathering of neighboring families. A summer tradition Nathaniel maintained for the practical purpose of maintaining relationships with men whose goodwill affected his business interests. Evelyn organized everything: the food, the seating, the arrangements, the timing of each course, the accommodation of 3 families with children, the careful placement of people who didn't like each other away from each other. All of it passed through her hands, and all of it appeared as though it had simply happened seamlessly, because she was good enough at her work that the effort became invisible. Which was, she thought, rather the theme of her life in this house. She was moving through the gathering with a quiet efficiency, refilling glasses, and managing small disasters with a calm that came not from happiness, but from practice when she heard it. The voice belonged to Robert Aldrich, the neighbor with whom they'd been disputing the eastern boundary. He was speaking to another man. She didn't recognize him, and he hadn't noticed her approaching. "Married the Carter girl, you know. Whole county thought it was temporary until he could marry the Hale widow. She knew it too, I expect." "And now," the other man said, "now she runs his house better than he deserves, and he barely knows she's alive." Aldrich shrugged. "Pity. She's a sensible woman." Evelyn set the glass she was carrying down on the nearest table. She did it slowly, carefully, with the same precise control she brought to every task. Then she walked through the gathering out the side door and stood alone on the east porch in the August heat until she was certain her face had returned to its normal arrangement. She stayed out there for 11 minutes. She counted them. When she went back inside, she was exactly as she had been: calm, efficient, invisible. But something had changed in her chest. That quiet thing that had been preparing to die had made its decision. She stopped hoping, not dramatically, not in any way that anyone watching would have noticed. She simply stopped, the way you stop carrying something when you finally accept that you've been going in the wrong direction and the weight is no longer worth it. She set it down, and without the weight of it, she found she could move faster. She started with the dairy operation. She had been making notes for months about the inefficiencies, the wrong feeding schedule, the poor pasture rotation, the aging equipment that cost twice as much in repairs as a replacement would have. She wrote up the changes she wanted to make, allocated the funds from the household account she managed, and implemented them. She did not ask Nathaniel's permission. She did not present it as a proposal. She simply did it. Within 3 weeks, the dairy yield increased by a third. She moved to the grain storage next. The weevil problem that had cost them 2 barrels of flour had been symptomatic of a larger issue with the storage room ventilation. She had it fixed. She also renegotiated the flour supply contract with a miller 2 towns over, cutting their quarterly cost by nearly a fifth. She kept records of everything, not to show Nathaniel, just for herself, because she had realized somewhere in those August evenings that the only person who was going to acknowledge her work was her, and that would have to be enough. Jonathan Pierce completed his survey of the eastern boundary at the end of the second week of August. He came to find her on his last evening, while she was in the kitchen garden cutting herbs for the following day. "I wanted to say goodbye properly," he said, "and to thank you." "The records were helpful?" she asked. "The records were essential." He paused. "Mrs. Whitmore Evelyn." He said her name carefully, like he was making sure he had the right to use it. "I want to say something, and I hope it won't be taken wrong." She looked up from the herbs. "Say it." "I've surveyed 40 properties in 6 counties," he said. "I've met a lot of people in the course of that work, husbands and wives, landowners, tenants. And I've learned to read a place fairly well, the character of a place." He held her gaze steadily. "This estate is held together by you. The workers know it. The records show it. The soil quality shows it." He stopped. "And I think you know that no one here has told you so, and that's a wrong that I can't fix. But I wanted you to hear it from someone." Evelyn set down the herbs. She looked at him for a long moment, this man she had known for 2 weeks, who had listened to her speak about crop rotation and land disputes and drainage systems, who had looked at her actual work and told her plainly what he saw. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady. She kept it that way. "That means more than I can say." He nodded, settled his hat back on his head, and turned to go. At the edge of the garden, he paused. "Take care of yourself," he said, "not just the estate." Then he walked down the path toward the road, and Evelyn stood among the herbs in the August heat and watched him go, and thought for the first time since October about what it might mean to be someone who was genuinely seen. Not loved necessarily. Not chosen in the way she had once dreamed. Just seen. She pressed her hands flat against the warm earth of the garden bed, and she thought, if one stranger passing through can see what I've built here, then I know it's real. And if it's real, it is mine. Regardless of whether he ever turns around and looks. That night she did not set Nathaniel's breakfast place before she went to bed. It was a small thing. It was the first thing she had kept for herself. She stopped setting his breakfast place, and he didn't notice for 4 days. That was the thing that stayed with her. Not the act itself, but the silence around it. 4 mornings in a row, Nathaniel Whitmore sat down at the table, poured his own coffee, and ate without once remarking that something was different. Without once looking up to find her and asking why the small rituals she had maintained through 10 months of an empty marriage had suddenly ceased. 4 days. She told herself it didn't matter. She had made the decision to stop waiting, and she had meant it. And a woman who meant something didn't revise it based on whether or not her husband noticed the evidence. But the knowledge settled in her chest, like a stone dropping into still water, quiet and heavy and final. He had not noticed, because he had never been watching. The place had been set each morning not because he expected it, but because she had been doing it for herself. Some last foolish performance for an audience of one who never turned toward the stage. She stopped performing. It happened in pieces the way most real changes do not, in a single dramatic gesture, but in the accumulation of small decisions made in private, each one unremarkable on its own. Each one adding to a weight that was slowly tipping something irrevocable. She stopped waiting up when he came in late from the study. She stopped adjusting her schedule to be present in the main rooms during the hours he was most likely to pass through them. She stopped softening her voice when she spoke to him about household matters, not hardening it, not making it cold, just letting it become what it actually was. The voice of a woman conducting business with someone she had a professional arrangement with. Nathaniel didn't notice that either. What he did notice, what finally made him look up from his correspondence one morning and actually regard her, was the dairy report. She had left it on his desk. Not handed it to him, not presented it, just left it there with the monthly account summary, the way she left all the household records. He found it on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of August and came to find her in the small estate office with the paper in his hand. "These figures," he said. "Yes." She didn't look up from the ledger she was working on. The dairy yield increased by 32%. 34 if you include the end-of-week numbers. She turned a page. "I changed the feeding rotation and moved the herd to the north pasture in the afternoons. There's better shade cover and the grass quality is higher." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him standing there processing something, not the information itself she suspected, but the fact that it existed. That she had done it without asking. That it had worked. "You didn't mention you were planning changes to the dairy operation," he said. She looked up then. "Would you have approved them if I had?" He opened his mouth, closed it again. Honest enough at least not to answer that immediately. "I would have considered them. With respect," she said, keeping her voice even. "You've been occupied with other correspondence this month. The decision needed to be made before the late summer heat made the pasture rotation pointless. I made it." She held his gaze. "The results are in the report." He looked at the paper in his hand. He looked at her. Something moved across his face. Not anger, not exactly, more like the expression of a man who has stepped into a room and found the furniture rearranged. Not damaged. Just different. In a way he hadn't authorized. "In the future," he said, "I'd appreciate being consulted." "Of course," she said pleasantly. He left. She looked back down at her ledger, and a small quiet thing happened in her chest. Not triumph exactly, but something adjacent to it. The particular satisfaction of a woman who has stopped asking for permission and found that the world did not in fact collapse. She moved on to the grain contract review. The grain contract with the Hendley mill had been overcharging them for 2 years. She had known this since spring, when she'd finally had time to read through the original agreement and compare it against actual delivery weights. The contract specified a price per bushel at a fixed weight, but the deliveries had been coming in consistently, 2 to 3 pounds light per unit, a small discrepancy per delivery, that compounded into a significant overcharge across a full year's worth of transactions. She wrote to the Hendley mill directly. She did not tell Nathaniel she was doing so. Not out of defiance, she had simply assessed the situation, determined the appropriate response, and taken it. The same way she had always managed this house. The same way she had been managing it for 10 months while Nathaniel managed other things. The mill owner's response came 12 days later, addressed to Mr. Whitmore. She opened it anyway. She was the one who sorted the correspondence. The mill owner was apologetic, blamed a faulty scale, and offered to apply a credit to the next 6 months of deliveries. The credit amounted to nearly $40, a meaningful sum. She filed the letter, noted the credit in the account book, and wrote a brief acknowledgement on behalf of the estate. When the credit appeared in the following month's account summary, which she also left on Nathaniel's desk, he came to her office again. "The Hendley mill credit," he said. "Short weight deliveries going back approximately 2 years, she said. "I found it in the original contract review. I corresponded with the mill and they've agreed to apply the credit in installments." He stood in the doorway holding the account summary in both hands. "You found a 2-year overcharge," he said slowly. "Yes." "And you resolved it?" "Yes." The silence that followed was longer this time. She returned to her work because the conversation was from a practical standpoint finished. "Evelyn," he said. She looked up. He almost never used her name. He used it so rarely that when he did, it registered as a kind of small shock, like a lamp suddenly lit in a room you'd gotten used to navigating in the dark. "Yes," she said. He appeared to be looking for something to say. Something that would be adequate to the moment, which was a moment that seemed to be telling him several things about his own household that he hadn't known. After a few seconds, he said, "Good work." 2 words. The same 2 words you'd say to a farmhand who'd mended a fence well. "Thank you," she said. He left. She let out a breath slowly through her nose and went back to the ledger. Good work. She had been keeping this estate solvent for 10 months, and the sum total of his acknowledgement was 2 words that conveyed approximately the same warmth as a man thanking the postwriter for arriving on time. She picked up her pen. She kept going. Margaret Hale came to call on a Thursday. Evelyn had learned to predict these visits by a kind of atmospheric change in the house. A subtle shift in Nathaniel's manner, the morning before a slight increase in the attention he paid to his own appearance. A small stiffening of Dolly's expression that the housekeeper could not quite conceal. Dolly, Evelyn had come to understand, did not approve of Margaret Hale. She never said so. She expressed it entirely in the precise way she set the tea things, when Margaret was expected too correct, too careful, the kind of service that conveyed nothing at all. Evelyn was in the estate office when Margaret arrived. She heard the voices in the hall finish the sentence she was writing, and then came out to greet her guest with the same composed courtesy she brought to every social obligation. "Mrs. Hale," she said, "what a pleasant surprise." It wasn't a surprise, of course. And from the slight flicker in Margaret Hale's expression, she knew Evelyn knew it wasn't. "Mrs. Whitmore." Margaret's smile was careful. She was a handsome woman, dark-haired, well-dressed, with an ease of manner that came from having always been in rooms where she was wanted. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all. I'll have Dolly bring tea." They sat in the front parlor, Evelyn on one side, Margaret on the other, Nathaniel arriving 20 minutes later, with the look of a man who had spent those 20 minutes deciding how to enter a room containing both of them. The conversation was social in the way that conversations between careful people are social, all surface, and no pressure. The upcoming harvest fair, the Hargrove family's new addition, the condition of the river road after the recent rains. Evelyn participated with the precise degree of engagement required by politeness, neither withdrawing into silence nor asserting anything that would make the dynamic more complicated than it already was. She watched Nathaniel. He didn't speak to her directly during the entire visit. He was not rude. He was never rude. That wasn't in his character. He simply moved through the conversation in a way that positioned her as peripheral. A necessary presence managed with courtesy not included. It was, she thought, a very precise map of their marriage. When Margaret rose to leave an hour later, Nathaniel walked her to the door. Evelyn remained in the parlor, listening to the sound of their voices on the porch, lower now, less formal. The voices of people who were comfortable with each other in a way that had nothing to do with propriety. She heard Margaret laugh again, that easy, unguarded sound. She heard Nathaniel say something she couldn't make out, but the tone was different from any tone he used with her. She picked up her teacup and found it had gone cold. She set it back down. She thought about Jonathan Pierce saying, "You are the only one keeping this estate alive." And about the way he had said it, not as a compliment, not as something designed to make her feel better, but as a plain observed fact, the way a man who looked at things clearly named what he saw. She thought about Nathaniel saying good work in the flat contained voice of a man acknowledging a satisfactory transaction. She thought about the difference between those two things. Then she stood, straightened her dress, and went back to the estate office because the Southfield drainage report needed to be finished before the end of the week, and she was the only person in this house who was going to finish it. The second twist came from a direction she hadn't anticipated. It came from old Thomas. Thomas had been with the Whitmore estate for 23 years. He was somewhere in his 60s, broad-shouldered, despite his age, with a slow, deliberate way of speaking that she had initially mistaken for reluctance, and had since come to understand as simple precision. He said what he meant, and nothing more. He had been in her early months politely distant. Not cold, but measured in the way of a man who had seen household arrangements come and go, and had learned not to invest in newcomers until he understood what kind of people they were. He had apparently made his determination sometime in June, because by July, he had begun appearing at the door of the estate office with questions that he used to take directly to Nathaniel, Small operational decisions about the grain storage, the pasture rotation, the maintenance schedule for the farm equipment. By August, he came to her first as a matter of course. She hadn't remarked on it. Neither had he. But on the last Friday of August, he came to the office with something different. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands. He always removed his hat when he came to the office, which she had noticed, and he said, "Mrs. Whitmore, need to speak to you about something, not estate business." She set down her pen. "Come in, Thomas. Sit down." He sat, which he rarely did. He turned his hat slowly in his hands and looked at the floor for a moment before he looked at her. "There's talk," he said. "What kind of talk?" "Among the workers, about the estate." He paused. "About what happens to it?" She felt something shift in her chest, a quiet alertness. "What are they saying?" "They're saying Mr. Whitmore is thinking about selling the east acreage." He watched her face carefully. "The acreage that borders the Aldrich property, the boundary survey that the man Pierce just finished." She kept her expression neutral. "Where did this come from?" "Overheard. Men talk." He paused again. "The east acreage is the best tobacco ground we have. If that goes, the Southfield's going to have to carry the whole crop revenue, and the Southfield's being rebuilt. Your drainage plan won't complete until spring." He met her eyes directly. "If he sells that land before the Southfield is producing, this estate runs short." She understood what he was telling her, and she understood why he was telling her, not Nathaniel. Because Nathaniel didn't know what the Southfield drainage plan would do to their revenue exposure in the interim. Because Nathaniel hadn't read the crop projections she had compiled. Because Nathaniel had been occupied with other correspondence. "I'll look into it," she said. "Yes, ma'am." He stood, settled his hat back on his head. "I figured you ought to know before he decided anything." After he left, she sat very still for a long moment. Then she opened the account ledger to the east acreage revenue projections and began to calculate exactly what the sale would cost them. She found Nathaniel in the study that evening after dinner. This was unusual. She almost never came to his study uninvited. It was one of the unspoken arrangements of their marriage, one of the invisible boundary lines that they had both, without discussion, agreed not to cross. His study was his. The estate office was hers. They conducted their parallel management of the household from their respective rooms, intersecting only at meals and in the formal spaces of the house. She knocked. "Come in." He looked up from his desk with an expression that registered mild surprise before settling into the careful neutrality he kept for her. "Evelyn, I need to speak with you about the east acreage," she said. She didn't sit. She stood in front of his desk because sitting would have made this a social call, and this was not a social call. Something moved in his expression, a slight tightening. "Where did you hear about that?" "It doesn't matter. Is it true? Are you considering selling?" He set down his pen slowly. "I'm considering my options. The boundary survey is complete. The acreage is clearly demarcated. The Aldrich family has made an offer." "You cannot sell that land," she said. "Not this year." The room went very quiet. Nathaniel Whitmore was not a man who was accustomed to being told he could not do things. Not by anyone, and certainly not by the wife who had spent 10 months being invisible in his house. The expression that crossed his face was not quite anger, more the particular shock of a man who has reached for a door that has always opened easily and found it locked. "I beg your pardon," he said. "The Southfield drainage plan won't complete until March," Evelyn said. Her voice was steady. She had run the numbers 3 times that afternoon, and she was certain of them. "Until the Southfield is back in full production, the east acreage is carrying nearly 60% of our tobacco revenue. If you sell it now, you will not have enough crop income to cover the outstanding accounts with the Richmond creditors and maintain the estate through winter." He stared at her. "How do you know about the Richmond creditors?" "Because I manage the accounts," she said. "I have managed them since November, when I found that the quarterly reconciliation was 6 weeks behind. I brought them current, and I have maintained them since." She laid the paper she had been holding on his desk, the projection she had written out that afternoon, the numbers clear and specific and unanswerable. "This is what the east acreage sale will cost us if it closes before the spring harvest. He looked at the paper. He picked it up. She watched him read it, watched the way his eyes moved down the columns, watched the slight change in his posture as he reached the bottom figure. He set it down. "This is accurate," he said. "It's conservative," she said. "The actual shortfall could be higher if the winter is hard, and we have additional heating and maintenance costs." He was quiet for a long moment. She had said what she came to say, and she had nothing to add to it, so she waited. Outside the window, the evening insects had started up, the sound rising and falling in the thick August dark. "I was not aware," he said finally, "that the accounts were in this condition." "I know," she said. "I've been managing it." He looked up at her, then really looked at her the way he almost never did, the way that felt different from the practiced courtesy glances and the brief acknowledgments and the two-word compliments for satisfactory work. He looked at her like he was seeing something he hadn't seen before and wasn't sure what to do with the fact that it had apparently been there all along. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. The question landed between them with a small, clean impact. She thought about how to answer it. She thought about the 12 breakfasts he hadn't noticed, the study door left open, the 4 days he didn't see that his breakfast place was no longer set. She thought about good work and the way his voice sounded different when he spoke to Margaret Hale. "I didn't think you were looking," she said. The silence that followed was the longest of their marriage. "Don't sell the East acreage," she said. "At least not until spring. If you still want to sell it after the Southfield drainage is complete and the accounts are stable, that's your decision to make. But not now." She picked up the projection from his desk because she would need it for her own records, and she walked to the door. "Evelyn," he said. She stopped but didn't turn. "Thank you," he said. And this time, it was not 2 flat words for a satisfactory transaction. It had something else in it, something uncertain, like a man feeling for a step in the dark and not being entirely sure the ground was where he thought it was. She didn't answer. She walked back to the estate office and sat down at her desk in the lamplight and looked at the stack of ledgers she had been maintaining for 10 months, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not pride exactly, something quieter, something that belonged only to her. "I know what this place is worth," she thought, "even if he doesn't." September arrived and brought with it a slight loosening of the heat. Not cool, not yet, but the edge came off the worst of it, and the mornings began to carry a faint promise of autumn that the August mornings had not had. The workers felt it. The pace of the harvest prep quickened. The estate came alive with a specific kind of organized urgency that Evelyn had spent months building toward the right people in the right roles, the right supplies, staged in the right places, the right schedules built into the daily rhythm of the farm, so that the work happened almost automatically. She had built that. Piece by piece, decision by decision, over 10 months of quiet, unacknowledged labor. Thomas came to her on the 3rd morning of September with a look on his face she hadn't seen before, or rather she had seen it once briefly, when Jonathan Pierce had said, "You are the only one keeping this estate alive." It was the look of someone about to say something true that they had been holding back. "The Hargrove foreman was here yesterday," he said, "while you were in town." She looked up. "What did he want?" "He came to see if you'd be willing to share the drainage plan. Word got around about the Southfield project. Hargrove's thinking of doing something similar on his north property." Thomas paused. "He didn't ask Mr. Whitmore. He asked for you specifically." She set down her pen. She sat with that for a moment, the particular startling weight of it. A neighboring estate's foreman arriving at the Whitmore property, asking not for the landowner, but for his wife, because the work she had done had become visible enough to enough people that they were coming to find it. "Tell him I'll write to him," she said. "I'll send the plan with my notes on the soil assessment methodology. He'll need to adapt it to his specific drainage grade." Thomas nodded. He was almost smiling. She could see it at the corners of his mouth. "Yes, ma'am." After he left, she returned to her work, but something had shifted in the quality of the silence around her. It was the same estate office, the same ledgers, the same stacks of correspondence, but she was sitting differently in it, taking up more of her own space, She thought about what Jonathan Pierce had said about being seen, about how it was something you could not manufacture. You either were seen or you weren't, and the sadness of it was that invisibility had nothing to do with your actual substance. You could be real and still be looked through. But she was not being looked through anymore. Not by everyone. And she was beginning to understand that the question of whether Nathaniel Whitmore ever turned around and saw her, that question, which had consumed 10 months of her life, which she had carried the way you carry a wound that won't close, was no longer the most important question. The most important question was what she was building. Because she was building something. She could see it now clearly, in a way she hadn't been able to see it when she was still facing toward him waiting. The drainage plan shared with Hargrove. The dairy operation running at 1/3 higher yield. The account overcharge recovered. The east acreage preserved through a financial argument she had built from numbers she had compiled herself. The workers who brought their questions to the estate office because they knew the answers lived there. She was building a life, not the life she had imagined at 23 sitting in her father's parlor, counting wallpaper stripes. Not the life of a woman who had married and been chosen and been loved. A different life, one that she had not planned and had not wanted and had arrived at through loss and silence and the slow death of hope. But real. Hers. Solid in a way that nothing Nathaniel Whitmore could give her or withhold from her could touch. She picked up her pen. She kept going. It was a Wednesday evening in the second week of September when Nathaniel came to her office. Not with a report, not with a question about the accounts. He came with nothing in his hands, which she noticed immediately, because it was so unusual. Nathaniel always carried something, a paper, a ledger, some object that gave his hands a purpose and his visit a stated reason. He stood in the doorway. "May I come in?" he said. She looked up. The question itself was unexpected enough to make her pause. He had never asked before. He was the owner of the house. He came and went. "Of course," she said. He came in and sat in the chair across from her desk, the chair that Jonathan Pierce had sat in on his first evening at the estate. He folded his hands on his knees and looked at her with the expression of a man who has been preparing something and has now arrived at the moment of delivery and is not certain it's going to be enough. "I've been thinking," he said. She waited. "I spoke with Robert Aldrich last week. He mentioned—" He paused. "He said the Hargrove foreman had been to see you about the Southfield drainage plan." "He came with questions," she said. "I offered to share the methodology. Aldrich also said—" He stopped again. This was not easy for him. She could see that. Nathaniel Whitmore was a man who had spent 32 years being assured of his position, and whatever he was trying to say was requiring him to step somewhere uncertain. "He said the survey Pierce did, the boundary resolution, was largely your work, that you had the matter half solved before Pierce arrived." "The records were in good order," she said. "Evelyn?" He said her name again and again. It had that quality of a lamp lit in a dark room, sudden, slightly disorienting. "I need to ask you something directly." "Ask it." "How long have you been managing this estate?" The question sat between them. She thought about how to answer. She thought about October and the household accounts that were 6 weeks behind. She thought about the dairy operation, the grain contract, the Southfield drainage plan, the creditor accounts in Richmond. She thought about 10 months of breakfasts she had set and the 4 days he didn't notice they'd stopped. "Since November," she said. "Though you've been making the large decisions, I've been making the ones that keep things running between them." He absorbed that. "That distinction," he said slowly, "may be less meaningful than I've treated it." She didn't respond. It wasn't a question. "I owe you." He stopped, started again. "I have not—" He pressed his lips together and tried a third time, and something in his face shifted in a way she hadn't seen before. Something dropped, some careful structure he kept in place, and for just a moment he looked like a man who was genuinely trying to find words for something real. "I have not been fair to you in my management of this household, or in—" He gestured slightly at the space between them. "Other matters." She held very still. She had not expected this. She had not been waiting for it. She had made her peace with not waiting. But it was here anyway, and she found that it didn't feel the way she had once imagined it would feel. Back in October, back in the early months, when she had still been hoping, she had imagined that if he ever acknowledged what was happening between them, she would feel relief. Something releasing. What she felt now was more complicated than that. She looked at him, at the man she had been invisible to for 10 months, who was sitting across from her with his hands folded on his knees, and something uncertain in his eyes. And she felt something that was almost pity, and something that was almost anger, and something underneath both of those that was quieter and harder, and that she would need more time to name. "Thank you for saying so," she said. He looked at her like he expected more. Like he had offered something and was waiting to see what she would offer in return. She picked up her pen. "If you don't mind," she said, "I need to finish the harvest schedule before morning." He sat for a moment longer. Then he stood quietly and went to the door. "Good night, Evelyn," he said. "Good night," she replied. She listened to his footsteps down the hall. She listened to the sound of the study door opening and closing. Then she looked down at the harvest schedule in front of her, and she did not move for a long time. He saw it, she thought. Finally. After 10 months he finally looked, and then with a clarity that was almost painful. It came too late to fix what it was too late to fix. She didn't know yet what that meant for what came next. She didn't know what she wanted. She only knew that the woman who had sat in her father's parlor counting wallpaper stripes and telling herself that warmth would come if she was quiet enough and good enough and patient enough, that woman was gone. And the woman who had replaced her was someone she was still in the process of meeting. She finished the harvest schedule. She was the last one awake in the house that night, as she almost always was. The lamp burned on. The harvest came in hard and fast, that September, the way it did in good years, everything ripening at once, the fields demanding more hands and longer hours, and decisions made quickly before weather or time took the choice away. Evelyn had spent 3 weeks building toward this. The schedules were in place, the workers knew their assignments, the equipment had been serviced and staged. When the first cutting crews went out on the morning of the 12th, everything moved the way she had planned it to move. Nathaniel watched from the edge of the north field. She saw him standing there when she came out to speak with Thomas about the afternoon rotation, standing with his arms crossed and his eyes moving across the organized activity of his own harvest, with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not pride. Not satisfaction. Something more uncertain than either of those. The expression of a man taking inventory of a thing he hadn't built and wasn't sure how to hold. She didn't go to him. She spoke with Thomas, confirmed the afternoon schedule, and went back inside to work through the morning correspondence. But she felt his eyes follow her across the yard. That was new. She told herself it didn't matter. She had been telling herself a lot of things didn't matter, and the discipline of it had become its own kind of practice. A muscle she had built through repetition, through the months of quiet work and quiet grief, and the slow, hard business of building something real in the absence of the thing she had actually wanted. The muscle was strong now. She could feel it. What she hadn't counted on was how strange it would feel when he finally started looking, and how much less simple the feelings would be than she had imagined they'd be back when she was still hoping he would. The letter arrived on a Thursday. It came from Richmond, addressed to Nathaniel, but she sorted the correspondence as she always did, and the name of the sender stopped her cold. Randolph Carter, her father. She set the other letters aside and held this one for a long moment. Her father had not written to the Whitmore estate since the wedding. All communication had been conducted through Nathaniel, directly, the two men maintaining whatever arrangement they'd made between themselves. For her father to write now, nearly a year into her marriage, meant something had changed. She brought the letter to Nathaniel unopened. He was in the study. She set it on his desk without comment, and he looked at the name on the front, and then at her with a slight wariness she didn't have time to interpret before she left. 2 hours later, he came to the estate office. She knew from the way he walked slower than usual, deliberate in the particular way of a man carrying information he wasn't sure how to deliver. "Your father writes that he has recovered a portion of his losses," Nathaniel said. He stood in the center of the office rather than in the doorway. "He believes he will be in a position by spring to repay the agreement between our families." She looked at him. "What agreement?" The silence lasted exactly long enough for her to understand what kind of silence it was. "What agreement?" she said again. Her voice was very quiet. Nathaniel's jaw tightened slightly. "When our marriage was arranged, your father's circumstances required certain accommodations. I agreed to assume a portion of his outstanding debt in exchange for the marriage contract." The room did not move. Nothing in it changed. The ledgers were exactly where they always were. The lamp was burning at the same angle. The correspondence was stacked in its usual place. Everything was exactly as it had been 30 seconds ago. "You purchased me," she said. "That is not—" He stopped. "It was a business arrangement. Standard practice for—" "You purchased me," she said again. Not loud, not shaking. Just absolutely perfectly clear, the way you say something when you need to hear it out loud in order to believe it is real. He looked at her. And she saw something in his face that was not denial. It was closer to shame. And shame on Nathaniel Whitmore's face was such an unfamiliar thing that it almost softened her before she caught herself. "I should have told you earlier," he said. "Yes," she said. "You should have." "Evelyn." "I need you to leave this room," she said. "Please." He left. She sat at her desk and looked at the wall for a very long time. She thought about her father's careful, apologetic letters over the years. She thought about the way Nathaniel had shaken her hand at their first meeting, polite, appraising the handshake of a man conducting due diligence. She thought about the wedding, the minister, the 17 guests, the ring placed on her finger with practiced propriety. She had always known she was an arrangement. She had not known she was a transaction with a price. She picked up her pen. She had work to do. Right. She didn't speak to Nathaniel for 3 days, beyond what the business of the estate required. He noticed. She could tell because he began appearing at the edges of things, not imposing himself, not demanding her attention, just present in rooms where he hadn't usually been present. The kitchen doorway in the morning. The east porch in the late afternoon. The hall outside the estate office with no stated reason for being there. It was, she thought, with a bitterness that surprised her with its sharpness, the most attentive he had been in 10 months of marriage, and it had taken the threat of her anger to produce it. On the 4th day, Thomas came to her with a look on his face that she had learned meant something requiring immediate attention. "There's a man at the South Field," he said. "Name of Garrett. Says he's a creditor from Richmond. Says he has a lien on the property." She was on her feet before he finished the sentence. The man named Garrett was standing at the edge of the Southfield drainage works when she found him broad unhurried, with the particular confidence of someone who believed the law was entirely on his side. He had papers in his coat pocket. She could see the shape of them. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said when she introduced herself. He said it with a slight emphasis that made clear he knew exactly who she was and had specifically not expected to be dealing with her. "My husband is occupied with the harvest," she said. "What is the nature of your claim?" He pulled the papers from his coat. "Whitmore Estate has an outstanding note with Garrett and Associates of Richmond going back 3 years. Payment was due last spring. We've been patient, but patience has a limit." She took the papers from him and read them. She read them carefully, the way she read everything all the way through. Not stopping at the places that looked alarming, because the alarming places were often not where the actual problem was. She found the actual problem on the 3rd page. "This note was restructured in January of 1813, she said. Under the restructuring agreement, the payment schedule was extended by 18 months. The payment due last spring was not actually due, it was included in the extension." Garrett's expression shifted slightly. "That restructuring was informal. It was signed by your principal and by Mr. Whitmore and witnessed by a county clerk." She kept her voice perfectly even. I have the copy in the estate records. Shall I retrieve it? He looked at her for a long moment. He was recalculating something. She could see it happening. I'll need to verify with my principal, he said. Of course, she said. When you do, you'll also find that we have made 3 additional partial payments against the note since January of this year, which I can document precisely. The outstanding balance by my calculation is substantially lower than the figure cited in these papers. She handed the papers back to him. You're welcome to come to the house and review the account records if you'd like to reconcile the figures, she said. But I think you'll find that a lien on this property is not supported by the actual state of the accounts. He took the papers. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, you manage the accounts yourself, Mrs. Whitmore. I do, she said. He looked at her the way people sometimes looked at her when they discovered this not quite disbelief, more a recalibration of expectation. A woman who had the numbers. A woman who had the documents. A woman who knew where the restructuring agreement was filed and what it said on the 3rd page. I'll be in touch, he said. He left. She stood at the edge of the Southfield drainage works for a moment after he was gone, looking at the neat lines of the new channels she had designed. The work that was 3/4 complete. The investment that would pay the estate back in productive soil capacity for a generation. Then she walked back to the house to find the restructuring agreement and write up a complete account reconciliation before Garrett could do anything rash. She found Nathaniel in the hall. He had seen Garrett leave. She could tell from his expression that same look from the doorway of the study when she had corrected him about the dairy yield, that recalibrating the room expression. What did he want? Nathaniel asked. He had a claim on the property, she said. It wasn't valid. I've sent him to verify with his principal. I need the restructuring agreement from your personal files, the one from January 1813, with the county clerk's witness signature. He stared at her. You already know about that agreement. I found a reference to it in the account correspondence last spring, she said. I didn't have the original document, but I knew enough to bluff with confidence. She met his eyes. I need the actual document now in case he comes back. He went to his study without another word and returned with the document in 60 seconds. He held it out to her. She took it. Evelyn, he said. I'll have a full account reconciliation prepared by this evening, she said. You should review it, in case Garrett sends anyone else. She walked to the estate office and didn't look back. The reconciliation took 4 hours. She was finishing the final page when the door opened and Nathaniel came in without knocking, which he had never done before, not since that evening when she'd told him to leave. She looked up, and his face had something on it that she hadn't seen in all their months together. He looked frightened. Not of Garrett, not of the creditor situation which she was managing. Something else. He sat down across from her without being invited, which he also never did, and he put both hands flat on the desk and looked at her like a man who has run out of the careful language he normally used and has nothing left but the direct thing. I need to tell you about Clara, he said. The name landed in the room between them. She set down her pen. Clara. She had never heard him say the name. She had only assembled it from fragments from the careful avoidances and the particular quality of his distance from the way certain rooms in the house had a feeling of having once been inhabited by someone he still carried with him. She had built the shape of this woman from silences, the way you build a picture from the space around a thing, rather than the thing itself. You don't have to, she started. I do, he said. I should have months ago. She waited. We were to be married. 12 years ago. She died of fever the summer before the wedding. He said it plainly, without the softening language people usually used for grief, just stated it, the fact of it, the way you state something you have been carrying so long that the words have worn smooth. I spent a long time after that telling myself I had managed it. That I had moved forward, taken up the estate, maintained the family interests, done what was required. He looked at his hands. I believe that. I believed it well enough that when your father's situation arose and the arrangement was presented, I thought I was capable of being a proper husband. I thought distance was the same as having healed. The room was very quiet. It wasn't, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. This man, who had been the author of so much of her pain, who had looked through her for 10 months, who had purchased her with her father's debt, who had left doors open when Margaret Hale was in the house, sitting across from her, with his hands flat on her desk and something genuine and painful in his face. I know about Clara, she said. I've known for some time. He looked up sharply. Not everything, she said. The outline. Enough to understand why you were the way you were. She picked up her pen and set it down again. It didn't help as much as you might think. Understanding a reason doesn't make the absence feel less like absence. He absorbed that. No, he said quietly. I don't imagine it does. Did you love Margaret Hale? She asked. She had never asked it before. She was asking it now because she found she was no longer afraid of the answer. He took a long time. I believed I might be able to, he said. Eventually. She reminded me less of Clara. It felt safer. A pause. That is not a flattering answer. No, she agreed. But it's an honest one. They sat in the quiet of the estate office, the two of them, with the account reconciliation between them and the lamp burning and the sounds of the harvest workers drifting in from outside. Two people in a marriage that had been built from the wrong materials for the wrong reasons, having the first real conversation they had ever had. What do you want? He said. From this. From, he gestured. From the future. She thought about it. Not quickly, not with the reflex of what she thought she was supposed to say. Really thought about it. I want what I've been building, she said. The estate, the work, the life I've built here which is real, regardless of the circumstances it was built in. She met his eyes. What I don't want is to spend another 10 months being invisible in my own home. You won't be, he said. I know, she said. And the certainty in her voice surprised even her because it didn't depend on him anymore. Whether he saw her or didn't, whether he became who she needed him to be or remained who he was, she would not be invisible again. She had learned how to be seen. She had built the life that made her visible. And no one could take that back. He heard it. She could see that he heard the difference, the quality of the certainty, the fact that it was not about him. He nodded once and said nothing more. Jonathan Pierce came back. She didn't expect it. He had finished his survey and taken his leave at the end of August, and she had not anticipated seeing him again. She had filed him in her memory as one of the rare good things of a difficult year, a man who had looked at her work clearly and named what he saw, and she had been grateful for it and released it. He appeared at the Whitmore estate on a Tuesday morning in late September, hat in hand, with the particular look of a man who has made a decision and is committed to it. Dolly came to find her in the estate office. Mr. Pierce is here, ma'am. She looked up from the account reconciliation. What does he want? Dolly hesitated. He says he's here to see you specifically. Said he has professional business to discuss. She set down her pen and went to the front hall. Pierce was standing where he'd stood the first time, the same posture, the same ease. But something was different in his face this time. More deliberate, less open. Mrs. Whitmore, he said. I'm sorry to arrive unannounced. Mr. Pierce. She studied him. What kind of professional business? There's a land acquisition opportunity, he said. Several families in the next county are looking for an experienced estate manager to evaluate the property before purchase. The county land office recommended you. She went very still. The land office recommended me, she said slowly. By name, he said. Word of the Southfield drainage work and the Aldrich boundary resolution has moved further than you might think. He looked at her steadily. It's paid work, Mrs. Whitmore. Consulting work. 3 days of assessment, a written evaluation, fair compensation. She stood in the hallway of the Whitmore estate and let the full weight of what he was telling her settle. The county land office. Her name. Recommended by name. Not Nathaniel Whitmore's name. Not the Whitmore estate's name. Her name. When would they need the assessment? She said. 2 weeks from now, if possible. I'll need to discuss it with my husband, she said. Something in Pierce's expression shifted very slightly, barely perceptible, but she caught it. Not surprise exactly. More like a careful watchfulness, the expression of a man who has thought about what this conversation might contain and is paying attention to how it goes. Of course, he said. She brought him to the front parlor, had Dolly bring tea, and excused herself. She went to find Nathaniel. He was in the study. He was always in the study these days, and she had a theory about that, which was that since their conversation about Clara, he had been spending more time in the room closest to where she worked, in the same way he had been appearing at the edges of things since she'd stopped speaking to him directly. A man in motion now that there was something to be in motion toward. She knocked and entered without waiting. Jonathan Pierce is here, she said. He's brought a consulting offer from the county land office. They want me to assess a land acquisition for families in the next county. Paid work. Nathaniel was at his desk. He looked up, and several things moved across his face in rapid succession. Something that started as surprise sharpened briefly into something she recognized as jealousy, and then resolved with visible effort into something more considered. Pierce came here specifically for that, he said. Yes. A pause. Do you want to do it? The question was direct and careful. The question of a man who had been doing some interior work and was trying to apply it. Yes, she said. I think it would be good work. He was quiet for a moment. She watched him. She could see him working through it, the instinctive resistance, the pride, the particular discomfort of a man whose wife has been recommended by the county land office for professional consulting. She watched him arrive at something on the other side of all that. Then you should do it, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Thank you, she said. She went back to Pierce and told him yes. Pierce stayed for an hour going over the details of the assessment, the property location, the families involved, the specific questions they needed answered. He was professional throughout. Clear, specific, efficient. Exactly the same as he had been when they'd worked through the Whitmore boundary documents together. But when the business was concluded and he stood to leave, he paused in the doorway of the parlor. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You may," she said. "Are you all right?" He said it plainly without softening it into something indirect. "Here. In this house. Are you all right?" The directness of it reached something. She felt it in her chest, a small brief warmth, the warmth of being genuinely asked. "I am better than I was," she said honestly. "That's the most accurate answer I have right now." He nodded. "That's a real answer," he said. "I'll take it." "Mr. Pierce." She stopped him just before he turned. "Thank you. For the recommendation. For—" She paused. "For looking." He smiled, not a charming smile, just a real one. "You were easy to see, Mrs. Whitmore. That was never the problem." He left. She stood in the parlor for a moment after he was gone, and she heard a sound from the hall, the particular sound of a footstep that had stopped. She turned. Nathaniel was in the hallway entrance to the parlor. He had heard. She could see it in every line of his body. He had heard Pierce say, "You were easy to see," and he had heard what was underneath it, which was the implication about who had not been looking. His jaw was tight. His eyes were on her face. She looked back at him with the steady composure she had built over 10 months and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Pierce had stated a fact, and facts didn't require her defense or management. They just were. "Is the business concluded?" Nathaniel said. His voice was careful, controlled. "Yes," she said. "I'll be away 3 days in mid-October for the assessment. I'll make sure the estate operations are covered before I leave." He nodded once, stiffly. She moved past him to return to the estate office. "Evelyn," he said. She stopped. "He's in love with you," Nathaniel said. His voice had something raw in it. Not accusation, more like the sound of a man saying out loud a thing he has been trying not to know. "Pierce. Whatever he calls it, professional admiration, county land office business, he's in love with you." She turned to look at him. She considered denying it. She considered saying it was none of his concern. She considered several careful, managed responses. "I know," she said. The honesty of it landed between them like a stone. "Does he—" Nathaniel stopped, started again. "Have you to—" "No," she said, flat and clear. "I have not. I will not." She held his gaze. "I am still your wife. I take that seriously even when it is not taken seriously in return." The last sentence hit him. She saw it hit him. The slight flinch, the brief closing of his eyes, the breath he drew through his nose. "That was fair," he said quietly. "Yes," she said. It was. She walked back to the estate office, and behind her she heard nothing. No footstep, no door, no sound at all. Just the silence of a man standing in his own hallway, reckoning with the distance between who he had been and who he was going to have to become. The harvest came in fully that last week of September, and the numbers were the best the Whitmore estate had recorded in 6 years. Thomas brought her the tallies personally, which he didn't have to do. He could have left them on her desk. He brought them himself and stood in the door of the estate office with the paper in his hand, and something in his face that she had learned by now was the Thomas equivalent of celebration. "Best tobacco yield since 1808, he said. "The Southfield drainage plan helped with the moisture retention even this early," she said, looking at the numbers. "Wait until spring when the new channels are fully bedded in." "The workers are saying—" He stopped. "Well, they're saying things." She looked up. "What things?" "That this estate runs different than it used to." He paused carefully. "That things get decided and done. That when there's a problem, it gets solved." She held his gaze. "That's because of all of us," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "But it started with you." He left the tallies on her desk and went. She looked at the numbers for a long time. The best harvest in 6 years. The creditor situation managed. The boundary dispute resolved. The dairy yield up. The flour contract renegotiated. Her name in the county land office records as someone who could be trusted to assess a property accurately. She thought about October of the previous year, arriving at this house as a debt payment, dressed in wedding clothes, with nothing but her education and her resilience, and the stubborn, foolish hope that eventually someone would turn and see her. Someone had. Not who she had expected. Not in the way she had imagined. But she had been seen. And in being seen, she had learned to see herself, which turned out to be the thing that mattered most. Not because it made the loneliness smaller, or the loss of what she had hoped for easier to bear, but because when you know what you are worth, you stop accepting the price other people put on you. She was worth considerably more than her father's debt. She knew that now. She wrote that into no ledger, filed it in no record. She simply held it, this knowledge, private and solid and entirely hers, and let it settle into the same place where the last hope had died, and found that it fit there better. Took up more space. Left less room for the grief. The lamp burned on. Outside the harvest was in, and the fields were quiet, and the Whitmore estate was solvent and stable, and better managed than it had been in 6 years. She had done that, and somewhere down the hall in a study she had never been invited into until she had invited herself, a man who had spent 12 years living with a ghost, was beginning slowly and imperfectly, and much too late to understand what he had been standing next to all along. She left for the consulting assessment on a Wednesday morning in the second week of October, and she left without ceremony. Thomas had the horse ready before dawn. She had prepared the estate operation schedules 3 days in advance, every task assigned, every decision that might arise anticipated, and addressed in written notes left in the estate office where anyone managing in her absence could find them. She had done this the way she did everything thoroughly, without being asked, without expecting thanks. Nathaniel came out to the yard as she was mounting. She hadn't expected that. He was usually not an early riser, and she had timed her departure deliberately, not to avoid him exactly, but because the leaving felt like something private. Something that belonged to her alone. He stood in the yard with no coat on, despite the October chill, his hair not yet properly ordered for the day, and he looked like a man who had gotten up quickly because he'd made a decision and was afraid he'd lose it if he waited. 3 days, he said. 3 days, she confirmed. The schedules are in the office. Thomas knows what needs deciding and what should wait. He nodded. His hands were at his sides. He looked at her on the horse, looked at her the way he had been looking at her for the past several weeks, with that new quality of attention that she was still learning how to receive, and he said, "Be careful on the road." "I will," she said. She rode out. She did not look back. Not because she was being dramatic about it, not because she was proving something. She didn't look back because she was looking forward toward the road, toward the work, toward the 3 days that belonged entirely to her professional self, the self she had built from scratch in a house that hadn't asked for her with materials she'd gathered by hand. It was the first time she had ridden away from the Whitmore estate with somewhere specific to go. It felt extraordinary. Quietly, privately extraordinary, the way the best things feel when they happen not in a grand moment, but in the ordinary act of simply moving in a direction you chose yourself. The assessment took 3 full days. The property was a substantial parcel in the next county, good river access, mixed soil quality, existing structures in varying condition. The families considering the purchase had specific questions about agricultural viability, boundary clarity, and the condition of the drainage infrastructure. She worked methodically, taking notes in the same ledger format she used at the Whitmore estate, walking every section of the land on foot, despite the October mud, speaking with the neighboring property holders and the current tenants and anyone else who had direct knowledge of how the land behaved in different seasons. On the second evening, seated at the table of the family hosting her, she overheard 2 of the men talking in the next room not quietly enough. "The Whitmore woman knows what she's doing," one of them said. "Didn't expect it," the other admitted. "No one does," said the first. "That's the thing about her. She's already finished by the time you've decided whether to take her seriously." She sat with her notes and said nothing, and felt the warmth of it move through her chest, like a careful fire, steady and real and entirely earned. On the 3rd day, she wrote her assessment report and presented it clearly and without hedging, naming the land's strengths and its weaknesses, and her specific recommendations for both the purchase negotiation and the early development priorities. The senior member of the family group listened to her without interrupting, and then said, "What would you charge to oversee the first season of operations if we make the purchase?" She looked at him. She had not anticipated that question. She took a moment to think about it. Not the social response, not the modest deflection, the actual answer, and she named a figure. He didn't flinch. "We'll be in touch," he said. She rode home. The Whitmore estate came into view in the late afternoon light of the 4th day, and something happened in her chest when she saw it. Something complicated, not quite belonging, and not quite distanced the particular feeling of returning to a place that was hers by function, if not entirely by choice. She had built real things here. Whatever else this place was, it was also the ground of everything she had become over the past year. She was putting up the horse when Thomas appeared. His face was wrong. Not alarmed exactly, but carrying something. She had learned his face well enough to read it, and what she read now was, "Something happened while you were gone, and I have been waiting for you to come back so I could tell you properly." "What is it?" she said. He took her horse's lead. "Mrs. Hale came to call on the 2nd day," he said. He said it carefully, watching her face. She stilled. And Mr. Whitmore, he didn't receive her." Thomas paused. "She waited in the parlor an hour. He sent word that he was occupied with estate business and couldn't be interrupted." Another pause. "She left." The yard was quiet around them. "He did," she said. Not a question. Confirming she had heard it correctly. "Yes, ma'am." Thomas wasn't quite meeting her eyes, which she understood this was intimate information, the kind of thing that moved between households and meant things, and he was a man who knew how to carry it without making it larger than it was. She took her saddlebag from the horse. "Thank you, Thomas," she said. She went inside. Nathaniel was in the estate office. She stopped in the doorway. He was at her desk, sitting in her chair with the estate ledgers open in front of him and a look on his face like a man doing homework he should have done a year ago. He looked up when she appeared, and something moved across his face that she identified slowly as relief. "You're back," he said. "I'm back," she confirmed. She came into the room, set her saddlebag down, looked at the ledgers. "You've been reviewing the accounts." "Trying to," he said. He looked slightly uncomfortable. "Your record-keeping system is thorough." "I know where everything is," she said. "If you have questions." He closed the ledger and stood up from her chair with the particular movement of a man relinquishing a space he recognizes isn't his. He stood to one side and she took her chair, and for a moment they were simply two people in an office, rearranging around each other. "How was the assessment?" he asked. "Successful," she said. "They may want me to oversee the first season of operations if they proceed with the purchase." A pause. "Would you want to do that?" "Yes," she said. Another pause. Longer. "That would take you away from the estate, regularly." "Periodically," she corrected. "It would be managed." He looked at her steadily. She looked back at him steadily. This was new ground, the territory of two people negotiating something real, rather than performing the fixed roles of their arranged marriage, and they were both finding their way across it carefully. "All right," he said. "Thomas told me Margaret Hale called while I was away," she said. She said it without preamble, without softening, because they had agreed, without quite saying so, that they were past the stage of managing each other with careful language. He didn't flinch. She did. "You didn't receive her?" "No." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been doing some thinking these past months about what kind of man I've been in this house, what I've been asking you to bear." His voice was even, but the evenness had a different quality than his old evenness. This was not the flatness of a man maintaining distance. It was the steadiness of a man trying to say something real without flinching from it. "I decided that continuing to receive her here was not consistent with what I'm trying to do." "And what are you trying to do?" she asked. He looked at her. "I'm trying to be present," he said, "to what is actually here, to what is actually mine, what I have actually been given, if it will still have me." The room was very quiet. She sat with what he had said and let herself feel the full weight of it without rushing to respond. She had learned one of the things she could do, now that she couldn't do at the beginning of all this, sit with a difficult feeling without immediately trying to manage it into something easier. What she felt was complicated. She felt the warmth of it. She would have been dishonest to deny the warmth. This was the thing she had wanted for 10 months, this moment of being stood in front of and chosen, and even now even changed as she was. Even with everything she had built and everything she had decided about her own worth. The warmth was real, but she also felt the distance of it. The way 12 months of absence had put space between who she was when she arrived and who she was now. The woman who had sat in this estate hoping Nathaniel Whitmore would turn and see her, she wasn't here anymore. Someone had taken her place. Someone who no longer needed to be seen in order to exist. "I hear you," she said. "I need you to know that what I've become here, the work, the independence, the life I've built that isn't going away. I'm not going back to being invisible." "I don't want you to," he said. And he said it with a firmness that surprised her. "Why not?" She asked it honestly, not as a challenge. Genuinely wanting to understand. He looked at her for a moment. "Because you built something real," he said. "Because every time I've looked at this estate over the past 3 months and seen what's actually here, the accounts, the harvest, the workers who come to you with their questions, the county land office that sends consulting work to your name. I have been ashamed. Not of you, of myself, for not seeing it sooner." He paused. "And because you are someone worth seeing. I was the one who was blind. That's not your failure." The words sat between them. She let them sit. "I can't promise you what I would have promised you in October of last year," she said finally. "I can't promise to be the wife I was trying to be then. I don't know how to go back to that." "I'm not asking you to," he said. "What are you asking?" He looked at his hands for a moment, then at her. "I'm asking for the chance to learn how to be in the same room with you without looking through you." He said it simply, without drama. "That's all. The rest I don't know yet, what the rest looks like. But that's where I'd like to start." She held his gaze for a long time. "That's a modest request," she said. "It's the honest one," he replied. She thought about it that night, not at her desk, which was where she did most of her thinking, in her room, which she almost never used for anything but sleeping, because the estate office was where her life happened. She sat in the chair by the window and looked at the dark of the October fields and turned it over carefully. She thought about the woman she had been. She thought about the woman she was. She measured the distance between them and tried to determine how much of the distance was loss and how much was growth, and found that they were more tangled together than she had expected, that some of the things she had grown into existed because of what she had lost, and to wish the loss away would be to wish away the growth, and she was not willing to do that. She thought about Jonathan Pierce, about the warmth of being genuinely seen freely without transaction, without it costing her anything. She thought about what he had offered and what she had declined and why, and found that her reasons were still the same reasons they had been. Not obligation, not fear, but a recognition that integrity was something you kept not because it was easy, but because it was yours, and she had learned too much this year about what it felt like to have things taken from you to start giving parts of herself away carelessly. She thought about Nathaniel saying, "I'm trying to be present to what is actually here." She thought about whether that was enough. She thought about whether enough was even the right measure anymore. It was past midnight when she finally decided something. Not a decision about Nathaniel exactly. A decision about herself, about what she was willing to do with what remained of this marriage, and what she was not, and where the line was between those two things. She got up and went back to the estate office and wrote it out, not for anyone to read, just for herself, the way she had always processed the most important things in plain language on paper, where she could see it clearly. She wrote, "I will not pretend the past year didn't happen. I will not perform a forgiveness I haven't finished feeling. I will not stop being who I've become in order to fit back into who I was. But I will not close the door entirely. Because closing the door entirely is fear pretending to be strength, and I know the difference." She folded the paper and put it in the back of the household ledger, where the record of the first day she'd taken over the accounts still was. Then she went to bed. Chatunk. The next morning something happened that she had not anticipated. Margaret Hale came back, not to call on Nathaniel. She came specifically to ask for Evelyn. Dolly came to the estate office with an expression of perfect professional neutrality that concealed Evelyn suspected a considerable amount of personal opinion. "Mrs. Hale is here, ma'am. She says she'd like to speak with you privately if you're willing." Evelyn set down her pen. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then, "Show her to the front parlor. I'll be there directly." Margaret Hale was standing when she entered, not sitting, which told her something. People sat when they were comfortable or confident. Margaret was standing with her hands clasped in front of her, and an expression that Evelyn hadn't seen on her face before. Uncertainty. "Mrs. Whitmore," Margaret said. "Mrs. Hale," Evelyn said. She sat, and after a beat, Margaret sat too. "I'm going to say something directly," Margaret said, "because I think you deserve directness." "I appreciate directness," Evelyn said. "I came to this house too often this past year." Margaret held her eyes steadily. "I told myself it was friendship, and there was some truth in that. Nathaniel and I have known each other a long time, and there was genuine friendship between us. But I was not entirely honest with myself about what I was hoping for." She paused. "And in being dishonest with myself, I was not fair to you." Evelyn sat with that. "I'm not telling you this to ask for your forgiveness," Margaret continued. "I'm not certain I've earned the right to ask for that. I'm telling you because you have conducted yourself throughout this entire year with more dignity than the situation deserved, and I thought you should hear that acknowledged by someone who had a part in making it as difficult as it was." The parlor was quiet. Evelyn looked at this woman who had been for most of the past year the shape of everything Evelyn was not. The woman who had been wanted when Evelyn was merely useful. The woman whose name was in the room whenever Nathaniel's manner shifted into something warmer. She had resented her. She had been fair enough with herself to know she had resented her. But she had also spent 12 months becoming someone who did not conduct herself from resentment. "I appreciate you coming," Evelyn said. And she meant it, which surprised her slightly. "I understand that situations are rarely as simple as they look from the outside." "They're rarely simple from the inside either," Margaret said. A small, dry acknowledgement that landed between them with something that was almost the beginning of something. "No," Evelyn agreed. "They're not." Margaret rose. "I won't keep you. I know you're managing a great deal." She paused at the door. "For what it's worth, I've heard about the work you've done here. The harvest numbers, the consulting with the county land office. You've built something real, Mrs. Whitmore." Her voice was even, not flattering, just accurate. "That's not nothing." "No," Evelyn said. "It's not." Margaret left. Evelyn sat in the parlor for a moment after the door closed. She thought about the strangeness of life, the way people you had cast as simple characters in your own story turned out to be complicated when they finally spoke. The way being seen by someone you had expected to dismiss you felt different from being seen by someone whose admiration you had counted on. She went back to the estate office. She had barely sat down before she heard voices in the main hall, raised not shouting, but moving in that direction with the particular quality of an argument that was trying to stay controlled and not entirely succeeding. She recognized both voices. Nathaniel. And someone she placed a half-second later as James Whitmore, Nathaniel's younger brother, who came to the estate infrequently, and when he came, invariably brought disruption in some form. She had met him twice. She had not liked him either time, and she had the instinct that the feeling was mutual. She did not go to the hall. She stayed at her desk and let the voices rise and fall, catching fragments. "Made a fool of yourself, Nathaniel. And worse, you've made this estate vulnerable. I'll ask you to keep your voice down. If she leaves, what then? You think you can run this place without her? Talk to any man in the county. They'll tell you the Whitmore estate runs on Evelyn Carter's back. Her name is Evelyn Whitmore. Does she know that? Does she feel like a Whitmore? Or does she feel like an arrangement you made when you needed money?" A door slammed. Then silence. Then footsteps. Nathaniel's footsteps, heavy and fast, and then a knock at the estate office door, sharp and immediate. "Come in," she said. He came in. His color was high, and his jaw was set in the specific way it set when he had been handling something that required more control than he had entirely managed to maintain. He looked at her. She looked at him. "My brother," he said. "I heard," she said. "He's leaving tomorrow," Nathaniel said. "He came with some ideas about the estate's future, and I have made clear that his ideas are not welcome." She waited. "He suggested, among other things—" Nathaniel's voice was very controlled now, that particular flatness he used when something was costing him to say. "That he knows a man in Richmond who would be interested in making you a professional offer. For estate consulting. Full-time. Independent of this household." She went still. "He said that, did he?" she said. "He said he'd already made inquiries on your behalf, without your knowledge or permission." His voice was quiet and extremely careful. "I thought you should know." She sat with this new piece of information and turned it over. James Whitmore, making inquiries on her behalf, without asking. Using her reputation, her name, the reputation she had built by hand in this county, to arrange something that would serve his purposes, which were almost certainly related to destabilizing Nathaniel's position by removing the competent management of his estate and making the mess visible. She was not a piece to be moved by James Whitmore, any more than she was a debt to be settled by her father. "I appreciate you telling me," she said. "What are you going to do?" he asked. There was no possessiveness in the question, just the direct asking of it from one person to another. "Nothing James Whitmore arranged," she said. "If I take additional consulting work, I will arrange it myself with people who have come to me directly through the county land office, as has already been happening." She paused. "What I will not do is let your brother use my reputation as a tool in whatever argument the two of you are having." Something in Nathaniel's expression eased, not relaxed exactly, more like a tension released that he hadn't known he was holding. "Good," he said quietly. "What did you say to him?" she asked. When he suggested it, he was quiet for a moment. "I told him that my wife's professional decisions were her own to make, and that he had no standing in this household to make arrangements concerning her, and that if he wished to remain welcome at this estate, he would conduct himself accordingly." He paused. "And I told him that the state of the estate's management was not a failure, that it was the most functional this property had been in 6 years, and that he was welcome to take that information back to Richmond and share it with anyone he liked." She looked at him. He had defended her, not her position, not the estate's interests, her. The warmth moved through her chest again, and this time she didn't hold it at distance. She let herself feel it fully, carefully, without letting it mean more than it meant, or less than it meant. "Thank you," she said. "I should have been saying things like that all year," he said. "Yes," she said, "you should have." The honesty of it sat between them, not comfortable, not resolved, but real. The particular reality of two people who had stopped pretending. James Whitmore left the following morning before breakfast. Evelyn watched from the window of the estate office. She was not going to miss a morning's work to see off a man whose maneuvering had nearly gotten her name used without her consent. She watched the carriage pull out of the yard and felt nothing in particular about its departure. What she felt was the quiet that followed. The estate in the morning in mid-October, when the harvest was in and the urgent season was over and the work had shifted into the longer, steadier rhythm of maintenance and planning for the following spring. She had the Southfield drainage final phase to oversee. She had the winter accounts to prepare. She had the county land office families to correspond with about their purchase decision. She had somewhere in the middle distance the possibility of an overseen first season on a new property, and what that would mean for her time and her independence and the shape of her life going forward. She had a great deal. She was sitting with all of it, the morning's work spread in front of her, when Nathaniel appeared in the doorway. Not the sharp-knocked, urgent appearance of the night before. The slower, deliberate appearance of a man who had thought about coming and decided to. He was holding something. She saw it before she could identify it, a folded piece of fabric, dark wool, unmistakably old. He came in and set it on the edge of her desk. She looked at it. It was a small, plain shawl, old enough to have softened to a different texture than new wool. The kind of softness that came from years of handling. "It was my grandmother's," he said. "She managed this estate for 11 years after my grandfather died, before my father was old enough to take it. She did it the way you do it, quietly, without making a show of it, without waiting to be asked." He paused. "My father never spoke about her work directly, but he kept this." He looked at the shawl on her desk. "I found it in the back of the study closet 2 weeks ago. I thought about why he kept it. I think he kept it because he knew, even if he never said so, what her work had been worth. And he couldn't bring himself to let the evidence of it go." Evelyn looked at the shawl. She reached out and touched it, the old soft wool worn smooth at the corners. "I'm not my grandfather," Nathaniel said. "But I don't want to be my father either. I don't want to be the man who keeps the evidence in a closet and never says what it's worth." She looked up at him. There was a line she had been learning between being moved by someone's effort and being won over by it. Between recognizing that a person was trying and deciding that their trying had earned back everything their not trying had cost. She was not going to cross that line tonight. She was not going to rush herself across it or let the warmth in her chest make the decision that her full self needed to make. But she was also not going to be unmoved. Being unmoved, she had decided last night, was fear pretending to be strength. And she knew the difference. "Your grandmother sounds like a remarkable woman," she said. "She was," he said. "The estate records from her years are the clearest records we have. Better than anything my grandfather produced." He paused. "Better, I'll admit, than mine." "Not better than mine?" she said. And then, because she was in the process of allowing herself small things, she let the slight smile come. He saw it. Something in his face changed, eased genuinely for the first time in her experience of him. Not the practiced social ease he used with guests, not the guarded warmth he had used with Margaret Hale. Something simpler and more vulnerable than either. "No," he agreed. "Not better than yours." He left her to her work. She sat for a moment with the old shawl on the corner of her desk and thought about a woman she had never met, Nathaniel's grandmother, who had managed this estate for 11 years and kept it solvent and been known for the clarity of her records, and whose evidence had been kept in a closet because the man who had inherited her work hadn't known how to name what it was worth. She thought about the difference between being that woman and being herself. The difference was that she was still here. She was still in the middle of it. The story was not yet reduced to a shawl in a closet and the private knowledge of someone who hadn't said it out loud. She was still here, and the man who had failed to see her was trying to learn how to look. That didn't fix what had been broken. It didn't restore the 10 months. It didn't undo the transaction her father and Nathaniel had made over her future. It didn't make the year of invisible breakfasts and silent dinners and the slow death of hope into something retroactively acceptable. But it was real. It was something. And Evelyn Carter. Evelyn Whitmore, who had built something real in the wreckage of what she'd been given, she knew how to work with what was real. She picked up her pen. She pulled the morning's correspondence toward her. She had work to do, and the lamp was burning, and outside the fields were quiet and waiting. And somewhere in the future, not promised, not guaranteed, but possible. In the way that things become possible, when two people finally stop pretending and start trying. There was something that might yet be worth the building. She began. The letter from the county families came on a Monday. They had made the purchase. They wanted her to oversee the first season of operations. The compensation they offered was specific, fair, and more than she had expected. The letter was addressed to Mrs. Evelyn Whitmore, estate consultant, and it was the first piece of professional correspondence she had ever received that named her exactly as what she was. She read it twice. Then she set it on her desk, folded her hands on top of it, and sat very still for a moment. Not from hesitation, but from the particular practice she had developed over the past year of making herself feel things fully before she moved on from them. Of not rushing past the moments that deserved to be felt. This was one of those moments. She had been purchased as a debt settlement 14 months ago. She was now being purchased, hired, retained, sought out for the value of her own mind. She let that sit in her chest for exactly as long as it needed to. Then she picked up her pen and began drafting the acceptance letter. She was 3 sentences in when Nathaniel knocked. "Come in," she said without looking up. He came in and stood in the center of the room the way he did now, not in the doorway, not hovering at the threshold, but coming fully into the space. He had been doing that for several weeks. Small changes. She had been noticing all of them, cataloging them the way she cataloged everything without yet deciding what they added up to. "The county families wrote," she said before he could speak. "I know," he said. "I saw the seal when Dolly brought the mail." She looked up then. And I wanted to hear what you decided before I said anything," he said. That was new too, the waiting to hear. The sequence of it, her decision first, his response after. "I'm accepting," she said. He nodded once. "How long will you be away?" "It'll be periodic throughout the spring season. Not consecutive weeks, I'll be back and forth. But there will be days, possibly stretches of 3 or 4 days when I'm at the property." He was quiet for a moment. She watched him work through something. She could see it moving across his face, the old resistance and the newer discipline of it, the man he had been, and the man he was trying to become, having a brief private argument that he resolved without making her wait too long for the outcome. "I'll need to be more involved in the estate operations while you're away," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "You will." Another pause. "Will you teach me your system?" "The account system, the scheduling methodology. I've been trying to read through the ledgers, but they assume knowledge I don't have." She looked at him steadily. He was asking her to teach him. Nathaniel Whitmore, who had spent 14 months as the nominal head of an estate that had been running on her labor, was asking to be taught the system she had built. "Yes," she said, "I'll teach you." He exhaled. It was a small sound, barely perceptible, but she caught it. The exhale of a man who has been braced for a different answer. She went back to her acceptance letter. "Evelyn," he said. She looked up again. "I'm glad," he said, "that they recognize what you are. I'm glad someone did it formally, so it's on paper." She held his gaze for a long moment. The warmth was there again. She was not going to pretend it wasn't. But she was also not going to let it carry more weight than it had yet earned. "Thank you," she said. She finished the letter. She began teaching him the system that same week. She had not expected it to be what it was. She had expected a kind of formal instruction she would explain, he would listen, he would apply what she told him with the careful competence he brought to things when he was willing to apply it. That was the version she had imagined. What actually happened was different and harder, and in some ways more revealing than anything that had come before. On the second morning, sitting across from each other at the estate office table, with the account ledgers open between them, he made an error in the crop revenue projection, a simple arithmetic error, the kind she had stopped making months ago, because she had done these calculations so many times. They were instinct. She corrected it, without comment, the way she would correct anyone she was teaching. He looked at the correction. He looked at it for longer than the error required. "I should have been doing this from the beginning," he said. Not to her exactly, more to the ledger, the particular voice of a man talking to his own failure. "You should have," she said. She kept her voice even, not soft, not sharp, just honest. He looked up. She expected briefly that he might bristle some residual pride rising up. But he didn't. He just said yes, and went back to the work. That was the moment she adjusted something in her assessment of him. Not dramatically, not in a way that erased the record of who he had been, but a small, careful adjustment, the recognition that a man who can be corrected by his wife and respond with yes instead of defense is a man who is doing real work on himself, not just performing it. They worked through the morning accounts. He asked questions she hadn't expected him to ask, specific practical questions about the logic behind certain decisions, why she had structured the creditor payments in that particular order, what her reasoning had been for the flour contract renegotiation timing. "You were thinking 3 seasons ahead," he said at one point, looking at a projection she had built in the spring. "Always," she said. "I was thinking about the immediate season," he said, "at most." "That's the difference between managing and maintaining," she said. "Managing is anticipating. Maintaining is responding." He wrote that down. In the margin of the ledger, in his careful handwriting. She saw him do it, and something moved in her chest that she didn't have a name for yet, but that was not the simple warmth she'd been feeling. It was more specific than that. More particular. She made herself focus on the accounts. The first week of November brought cold rain and the specific kind of indoor intimacy that came with a house battening down against bad weather. Everyone closer together, all the ordinary distances compressed by the practical need to stay warm and dry. Evelyn noticed it, because the estate office was warmer when the rain kept her from the fields, and because Nathaniel had taken to spending his mornings at the small table she'd set up for him in the corner of the office, rather than in his study, and because the sounds of the house felt different when two people were occupying it in a different relationship to each other than they had been. On the third day of rain, Thomas came in from the south field looking wet and troubled and carrying news that made Evelyn's stomach drop. The new drainage channel on the south section. he said, shaking the water from his hat. The east wall of the trench collapsed in the night. About 30 feet of it. She was on her feet. How bad? Could be worse. The main channel's intact, but the east branch is flooded, and if we don't get the wall rebuilt before the ground freezes, we'll lose the drainage capacity in that whole section come spring. Evelyn was already moving to the map she kept pinned to the wall, the Southfield drainage map she had designed herself, every measurement noted in her own hand. Nathaniel was behind her. "What do we need?" he said. She was already calculating. "Timber for shoring, we have some in the north barn, but not enough. We'll need to get more from the Aldrich mill, and we need 6 men on it today while the rain softens the ground enough to work. If we wait, the soil compaction will make the rebuild twice as hard." "I'll ride to Aldrich myself," Nathaniel said. She turned to look at him. In 14 months of marriage, she could count on one hand the number of times he had volunteered to personally handle something that could have been delegated. "The roads are bad," she said. "I have a horse," he said. "Tell me exactly what to ask for." She told him. Timber specifications quantity, the credit arrangement she had already established with the Aldrich mill. He listened without interrupting, and when she was done, he repeated it back to her, all of it correctly, and then he left. She organized the work crew. She put Thomas in charge of the drainage wall assessment and set 3 men to clearing the flooded channel while the others waited for the timber. She put on her heavy coat and went out to the south field in the rain, because the project was hers and she was not going to manage it from inside. She was knee-deep in the logistics of it, timing the work, assessing the damage, making real-time decisions about what could be salvaged and what needed to be rebuilt from scratch when she heard hoofbeats and looked up. Nathaniel was back, in less than 2 hours. With a full wagon of timber behind him, the Aldrich mill driver managing the team, and Nathaniel himself, soaked through his coat and looking like a man who had ridden hard in bad weather and had no complaints about it. He came to find her at the edge of the trench. "Aldrich threw in extra timber," he said. "Apparently the county land office families mentioned your name to him, and he decided he wanted to be in your good graces." She almost laughed. It surprised her, the almost laugh, the way it came up without her expecting it. "Get inside and change before you freeze," she said. "I'll help first," he said. "Nathaniel." "I'll help first," he said again, and went to speak with Thomas about where to begin. She watched him for a moment, this man soaked and purposeful, working alongside the people who worked her land, and she felt the full, complicated weight of everything he was, and everything he had been, and everything he appeared to be trying to become all at once, without the buffer of distance she had maintained for months. It was a great deal to feel at once. She turned back to the drainage trench and kept working. The Southfield drainage wall was rebuilt in 2 days. On the evening of the second day, when the work was done, and the crew had gone in, and Thomas had declared the channel structurally sound, Evelyn stood at the edge of the repaired section and looked at it in the fading November light. Nathaniel came to stand beside her. They stood there for a while without speaking. 2 people looking at a thing they had built together, or rather, repaired together, which was not the same as building, but was its own kind of work. "It'll hold through winter," he said. "It'll hold," she said. "And by spring, when the final section is bedded in, it'll be the best draining field in 3 counties. He was quiet for a moment. "You designed all of this." "Last winter," she said, "when I had a great deal of time in the evenings." The implication of it sat between them. She hadn't softened it. She didn't take it back. "I know," he said. "I know what those evenings were." "Do you?" He turned to look at her directly. "You were alone. In the house I had made inhospitable to you, doing work I had not recognized, waiting for something I was too buried in my own history to give." He held her gaze. "I know what those evenings were. I am not going to pretend otherwise to make myself feel better." She looked back at him. This was the man she had not gotten at the beginning. This direct, accountable, fully present man who said hard things plainly because she deserved the plain version. She thought about the man who had shaken her hand at their first meeting and asked about her education. The distance between those 2 men was the length of a year. A year of loss and grief and quiet labor, and the slow grinding work of becoming. Hers. And she was beginning to see his. "What would you have done differently?" she asked. "If you had known. From October, what would you have changed?" He thought about it. She appreciated that he thought about it rather than answering immediately. "I would have read the accounts," he said. "Not had them managed for me. I would have come to your office in the first month and asked what you needed instead of assuming you needed nothing." He paused. "I would have told you about Clara, not as an explanation because it wasn't an excuse, but as information you deserved to have." He paused again. "And I would have received Margaret Hale exactly once and not again." She said nothing for a moment. "That's a good list," she said finally. "It's incomplete," he said, "but it's honest." "An incomplete honest list is better than a complete dishonest one," she said. "Yes." The corner of his mouth moved not quite a smile, something more careful than that. "I've been learning to prefer honesty. You're a significant reason for that." She looked at the repaired drainage channel. "I'm going to the county property in 2 weeks," she said. "The first assessment visit before the full season starts. I'll be gone 4 days." "I know," he said. "I have the estate schedules from last time. I'll manage." "I know you will," she said. And she found that she meant it not as reassurance, not as the careful management of his confidence, but as a genuine assessment of a man who had been learning his own estate for 6 weeks and was no longer the person who had looked at a dairy report and been surprised by a 34% yield increase. He had been paying attention. Finally, comprehensively paying attention. They walked back to the house side by side, not touching. Not yet, but close enough that she was aware of him specifically as a person beside her, rather than a presence she was navigating around. That was new too. The catalog of new things was getting long. She had been at the county property for 2 days when the letter arrived from James Whitmore. It was addressed to her, not through Nathaniel, directly to her care of the county family's address, which meant James had done more research into her whereabouts than she was comfortable with. She read it standing up, which was how she read things she suspected were going to require an immediate response. James Whitmore wrote with the particular smoothness of a man who believed he was being subtle. He framed it as professional interest. He had a contact in Philadelphia, a merchant consortium, looking to expand agricultural operations in Virginia, he said. They needed an experienced estate manager. The compensation would be, he implied, considerably more than she was currently receiving in the informal arrangement at the Whitmore estate. He noted almost as an aside that the arrangement would of course require her to be based primarily in Philadelphia. She folded the letter. She sat down. She thought about what James Whitmore was actually doing, which was attempting to remove her from the estate in a way that would look like her own ambition rather than his maneuvering. If she took a position in Philadelphia, the Whitmore estate would be without its management within a season. Nathaniel would be exposed not immediately, but progressively, the way a structure fails when the load-bearing wall is removed. And James would be positioned to offer assistance, to step in, to manage his older brother's financial recovery in a way that would shift control of the property. It was, she thought, reasonably clever. It would have worked on someone who didn't understand what she was looking at. She wrote back the same evening. She wrote plainly she was not interested in the Philadelphia position. She wished him well in finding a suitable candidate. She thanked him for thinking of her. Then, in the final paragraph she wrote, she had reviewed the Whitmore estate accounts thoroughly over the past year and was aware of all outstanding obligations and arrangements affecting the property. She looked forward to the estate's continued stability under the management system she had established. She trusted he shared that hope. She sealed the letter herself. She posted it the following morning. It was not a threat. It was a notification, a plain statement that she knew what he was doing and why, and that she was not a piece to be moved. She went back to the property assessment. She returned to the Whitmore estate on a Thursday. Nathaniel was in the yard when she rode in, not waiting, not standing around with the particular theatrical quality of a man staging a return. just actually there coming from the direction of the north barn, with mud on his boots, and Thomas beside him, mid-conversation, about something that required both of them to stop and look at a document Thomas was holding. He looked up when she came through the gate. He said, "The Southfield final drainage section is 2/3 complete." "In this weather," she said, dismounting. Thomas decided the ground was workable, and I agreed with him, he said. "We had the crew on it Monday and Tuesday. If the weather holds another week, we might finish before December." She looked at Thomas. Thomas was doing his almost smile again. "I'll review the progress report this afternoon," she said. "It's on your desk," Nathaniel said, along with the account reconciliation for November and a letter from the Richmond creditors confirming the final payment schedule. She stopped. "You completed the November reconciliation," she said. "I had some errors," he said. "Thomas helped me find 2 of them. The third one I found myself." He said it without either pride or self-deprecation, just the plain accounting of what had happened, which was exactly how she reported things. She looked at him. She looked at this man who had mud on his boots from supervising drainage work in November and had completed a monthly account reconciliation and had sent James's letter back with her response and had received no one to the house who should not be received and had managed, by all appearances, to run his estate for 4 days without her. He hadn't managed it perfectly. She would find the errors when she reviewed the reconciliation, but he had managed it genuinely, with real effort and real attention and the willingness to ask for help from Thomas when he needed it, rather than bluffing through. "Good," she said. "I also received a letter from the county land office," he said, "formally registering your consulting services with the county records." He paused. "Your name is in the county register now, as an estate consultant, formally." She stood in the yard with her saddlebag over her arm and felt the full weight of that, what it meant to have her name in a county register, to be a documented professional entity in a time and place where women's names appeared in records, mostly in relation to the men they belonged to, not in relation to anyone. Her own. "I should go look at the drainage progress," she said. "Evelyn," he said. She stopped. He came toward her, not fast, not with the urgency of a man who was afraid she would leave if he didn't move quickly. Deliberately, the way he did things now. He stopped at a distance that was close enough to be intentional. "I found something else while you were away," he said. "In the estate records, from 1803. She waited. "There's a deed," he said, "from my grandfather. He transferred the title of the small farmhouse on the east edge of the property, the one near the creek, to my grandmother. In her name. Not the estate's name. Her name." He paused. "I think he did it because she had spent 11 years running this estate, and he knew what that was worth, even if he never said it while she was alive." Another pause. "I had our solicitor draw up similar documents this week." She went very still. "What documents?" she said. "A deed to the East farmhouse transferred to your name, and an amendment to the estate operating agreement formally recognizing your role and compensation as estate manager, not as my wife managing my household, but as the professional manager of the Whitmore estate, with documented authority and documented pay." He held her gaze. "It should have been done a year ago. I'm doing it now because it's the right thing, and because you have earned it 10 times over, and because I refuse to be the man who keeps the evidence in a closet." She stood in the November yard and looked at him and felt the full complicated force of everything she had been and everything she had become, and everything that still lay ahead of her, unresolved and real and full of the particular uncertainty that came with being in the middle of something, rather than at the end. She thought about October of 1813 arriving as a transaction, hoping to become a person. She thought about every silent breakfast, every evening in the estate office with the lamp burning, every decision made alone, every account balanced alone, every small private victory she had celebrated without anyone to celebrate it with. She thought about what it had cost her and what it had built in her, and she found standing in the mud of her own yard, with her name newly entered in the county records, that she could hold both of those things at once, the cost and the building, without needing to resolve them into something simpler. "I haven't forgiven you entirely," she said. "I want to be honest about that. I know, he said. I'm not asking you to. The deed and the operating agreement, I accept them. Not as payment for what you owe, because they're right, and because they belong to me, regardless of what else is between us. Yes, he said. That's exactly how I intend them. And what else is between us, she said carefully, is something I'm not finished deciding about. He held her gaze and did not look away. I know that too. You're willing to wait, she said. Not a question. Testing it. I spent 12 years in this house not living, he said. I am not going to spend what's left of it waiting for permission to start. But waiting for you, that's different. That's not absence. That's being present while you decide. He paused. I can do that. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had taken a year to become someone she could be honest with, who had taken 12 years to stop living in a ghost's shadow, who had mud on his boots, and her name newly in the county records, and the evidence of his grandmother's life in his hands. Then be present, she said. That's where we start. She walked past him toward the estate office, because the November reconciliation needed her review, and the drainage progress report was on her desk, and the county families would need a winter assessment before the season turned, and there was as always work to be done. But at the door of the house, she stopped. She turned. He was still standing in the yard, watching her, not with the glazed looking-through quality of the man she had arrived to, but with the specific deliberate attention of a man who had finally learned how to see what was in front of him. Nathaniel, she said. He waited. The East Farmhouse, she said. I'm going to use it as an office for the county consulting work. I'll need it furnished properly. Something moved in his face, something that was relief, and something that was the first clear, unguarded warmth she had seen on him, and it looked different on his face than she had imagined it would look back in the months when she had been imagining it. More human, more ordinary, more real. I'll see to it, he said. By Thursday, she said. I have correspondence to send from there next week. By Thursday, he agreed. She went inside. She went to the estate office and sat at her desk and pulled the November reconciliation toward her and found the 2 errors Thomas had caught and the one Nathaniel had caught himself, and she corrected them and noted the corrections and moved on to the next page. Outside, she could hear him in the yard, the sound of his voice speaking to Thomas. Something about the drainage work timeline and Thomas's measured response, and the ordinary sounds of an estate being managed by people who knew what they were doing. She worked through the afternoon. She worked through the early evening. The lamp burned on. At some point, she didn't mark exactly when the sounds of the yard went quiet, and the house settled into its evening stillness, and then there was a knock at the estate office door. Come in, she said. Nathaniel came in carrying 2 cups. He set one on the corner of her desk, coffee dark and hot, and sat down across from her without a stated reason, and without picking up a ledger or a report or anything else that would have given his presence a business purpose. He was simply there. She looked at him across the desk. He looked back. The east side drainage should finish by Saturday if the ground holds, he said. Good, she said. I want to be there when they complete the final section. I thought you might, he said. I told Thomas to plan for it. She picked up her coffee. He picked up his. They sat in the lamplight of the estate office that had once been only hers, that was still formally, definitively hers. Her name now in the county records, her deed signed and filed, and they talked about the estate the way 2 people talk when they are both genuinely responsible for the same thing, and both genuinely paying attention. They talked for an hour. They disagreed twice about the spring planting schedule, and she was right both times, and he conceded both times without drama. They agreed on the winter maintenance priority order. He had a question about the creditor payment sequencing, and she explained it, and he understood it, and asked a follow-up question that was smarter than the first. When the lamp burned low and the work was done for the night, he stood to go. At the door, he paused. She thought he might say something, some final, careful declaration, some articulation of what this evening had been, but he didn't. He simply said, "Good night, Evelyn." "Good night," she said. He left. She sat alone in the estate office for a moment, in the house that had been a transaction, and had become her place of work, and was now slowly in the complicated and unfinished way of real things, becoming something she did not yet have the precise word for. But that felt for the first time in 14 months, like it had room in it for her whole self. Not the self who had arrived hoping to be chosen, not the self who had survived by becoming indispensable. The self she had built out of both of those, harder and more complete, and more entirely her own than either one had been. She extinguished the lamp. She had built this life with her own hands from the ruins of what she'd been given, and it was solid, and it was real, and it was hers, and no one, not her father, not James Whitmore, not the ghost of Clara, not the man who had finally learned to look, could take a single brick of it away. She walked to her room in the dark of the house she now owned a deed to, and she slept without waiting for anything. For the first time in 14 months, she had nothing left to wait for. She was already exactly where she had decided to be.